6 million purple sea urchins have been methodically crushed on the ocean floor during operations spanning more than 10 years. Why are these native organisms being systematically eliminated by the millions if they are not an invasive species? The answer lies in their transformation from inhabitants into a catastrophic symptom of an ecosystem that has completely lost its biological equilibrium. At first glance, the seabed looks like a thriving habitat, but in reality, the unchecked proliferation of these creatures indicates a profound environmental collapse. Over 700 different species once found sanctuary within the towering underwater cities formed by macrocystis kelp off the coast of Southern California. These massive algae structures reached heights of over 30 meters, creating a dense canopy that functioned as the foundation for the entire local marine food web. It seems simple for such a massive forest to endure, but the balance was far more fragile than it appeared. Everything only gets more complicated when observing the rapid rate of destruction that occurred over just a few short decades. More than 80% of the once lush kelp canopy has vanished from the surface of the water. The process is only gaining momentum as the living forests are replaced by desolate, rocky expanses completely covered in sharp purple spines. Scientists refer to these underwater biological deserts as urchin barrens, where almost no other life can survive. One can notice how the equipment and divers work to clear the seafloor, but this is just the beginning. The transition from a thriving forest to a barren wasteland happened with startling speed, leaving behind a landscape stripped of its primary producers. It is visible how the urchins carpet every available inch of rock, preventing the regrowth of any new kelp spores that attempt to settle. Removing these millions of urchins is a calculated attempt to unlock a forest currently trapped in a cycle of severe decline. The equipment gradually clears the way for the restoration of the kelp, allowing the natural underwater city to potentially rebuild itself from the ground up. This intervention aims to restore the historical balance that allowed the ecosystem to endure for centuries before its sudden destabilization. The biological material is cleared, opening the road for the recovery of the marine landscape. 30 meters is the height reached by the golden brown fronds of macrocystis pyrifera as they rise from the cold Pacific seafloor toward the surface. These giant kelp stalks interweave into a complex three-tiered structure that functions exactly like a terrestrial forest on dry land. Why did these underwater ecosystems become some of the most productive environments in North America? The nutrient-rich ocean currents flowing in from offshore provided a constant supply of fuel for growth. Under ideal conditions, a single kelp plant could increase in length by 60 centimeters in one 24-hour period. By the middle of the 20th century, tens of thousands of hectares of these kelp forests lined the California coastline. This was not merely a passive habitat, it was a fully functioning ecological infrastructure upon which more than 700 species of fish, invertebrates, marine mammals, and seabirds depended for breeding and feeding. Beyond the support of biodiversity, the kelp forest served as a natural coastal defense system. One can notice how the dense canopy absorbed the force of winter storms and reduced shoreline erosion. The equipment of nature trapped sediments and helped clarify the water while simultaneously storing carbon within biomass and seafloor deposits. The process is only gaining momentum. For generations, the Tongva and Chumash indigenous communities harvested this resource for food and tools. Later, a commercial kelp industry emerged to supply fertilizer and food thickeners to a growing population. It seems simple for such a massive system to endure, but in reality, the rapid expansion of Los Angeles began to exert a mounting pressure. The underwater forest persisted for decades until various disturbances accumulated and the ecological balance slowly tipped out of equilibrium. Transition to the next level. 80% of the kelp forest canopy had vanished by the time offshore surveys were conducted near Palos Verdes in the early 2000s. Satellite images that once captured shimmering golden patches on the ocean's surface now showed scattered dark gaps. The camera glides along the digital maps, revealing bare rock beneath deeper waters. This collapse did not stem from a single shock. Instead, it was the result of a chain of pressures that had been building for years. Runoff from the Los Angeles watershed carried sediment, heavy metals, and pollutants into the sea. These materials smothered the rocky reefs where kelp spores need to anchor and germinate. Coastal construction increased water turbidity, blocking sunlight from reaching the seafloor and constricting the vital process of photosynthesis. At the same time, overfishing depleted key predators. Large fish, lobsters, and other species that feed on urchins declined sharply in number. This broke the natural control mechanisms within the ecosystem. everything only gets more complicated. Then came successive marine heat waves, most notably the blob event between 2014 and 2016. During this period, Pacific surface temperatures rose abnormally across vast areas. Giant kelp adapted to cold water endured prolonged stress as growth slowed and regeneration weakened. One can notice how the structural integrity of the forest began to fail. Layer upon layer of pressure pushed the ecosystem further from stability. As the forest structure disappeared, the habitat for hundreds of species disappeared with it. The underwater landscape reached a point of total transformation. 150,000 to 300,000 sea otters once densely populated the Pacific coastline, stretching from the cold reaches of Alaska down to the shores of Baja California. Why did these specific mammals hold such a vital position in the marine ecosystem for thousands of years? At first glance, they appear as small, isolated predators, but in reality, they functioned as the underwater forest guardians maintaining a strict ecological order. The fur trade boom of the 18th and 19th centuries shattered this balance by devastating their populations through relentless hunting. By the early 20th century, these guardians had nearly vanished from the California coast. One can notice the severity of the decline, which exceeded 90%, leaving only a few dozen survivors eventually rediscovered in 1938 off the coast of Big Sur. It gets more complex further on. Ecologists formally classify the sea otter as a keystone species because their biological influence on the environment far outweighs their actual physical numbers. An adult individual can consume up to 25% of its total body weight every single day to fuel its metabolism. This equates to roughly 2 to 4 kilograms of food, consisting primarily of shellfish and sea urchins. It is visible how this constant predation pressure reshapes the entire seafloor. Studies show that in geographical areas with stable, healthy otter populations, the density of sea urchins can be up to 10 times lower than in regions where the predators are absent. This allows the kelp to grow undisturbed and rebuild the complex forest structure that provides a habitat for hundreds of species. Today, the population of sea otters in California has recovered to approximately 3,000 individuals, but these are largely concentrated along the central coast. But this is just the beginning of the logistical problem. They remain almost entirely absent from Southern California. This is the exact region where the kelp forests have suffered the most severe and sustained decline in recent decades. Their absence signifies more than just the loss of a single species. It represents the total removal of the highest level of control within the complex marine food web. It only looks obvious that the environment would adapt, but in reality, the lack of a predator causes the system to collapse into an urchin barren. When these forest guardians disappear, the ecological pressure does not vanish from the water. Instead, the pressure shifts downward and the physical consequences begin to surface on the sea floor as the kelp is consumed faster than it can regenerate. The balance of the underwater ecosystem remains fragile as the habitat transitions into a state of flux. 20 to 24 flexible arms allow the sunflower sea star to operate as the elite special operations unit of the seafloor. Why did these predators possess such a complex biological structure? At first glance, the anatomy seems cumbersome, but in reality, this configuration allowed them to dominate the lower layers of the ecosystem while sea otters controlled the surface. This physical design made them one of the largest and fastest sea star species ever documented along the Pacific coast. 1 meter is the approximate arm span reached by these massive organisms. The equipment of the ocean floor, the rocky substrate, serves as a high-speed track where they glide with surprising velocity. One can notice how their movement defies the typical slow-moving stereotype of their genus. But this is just the beginning. Urchins detect the mere chemical scent of an approaching sunflower sea star and immediately scatter in all directions. It is visible how this predatory pressure provides direct relief to kelp holdfasts, which are otherwise subjected to relentless grazing. The process is only gaining momentum until a biological disruption occurs. 2013 marked the emergence of a mysterious epidemic known as sea star wasting disease, or SSWD. It only looks obvious that a population would be resilient, but in reality, this pathogen erupted with devastating speed along the west coast of North America. White lesions appeared on the bodies of the sea stars as their tissues began a rapid process of decay. Arms detached from the central discs as the structural integrity of the organism ecosystems failed. One can notice the physical disintegration as the creatures turned into pale masses on the ocean floor within a matter of days. The process did not end at this stage. 90% of the sunflower sea star population declined in the vast corridor stretching from Alaska to Mexico. In many specific regions of California, the species vanished almost entirely from the ecosystem. This collapse created a profound ecological void that altered the balance of the seafloor. It gets more complex further on. Because the king of the seafloor disappeared, sea urchins were no longer hunted by their primary biological check. This total absence of predation became the critical tipping point for the environment. The next ecological tragedy began to take shape as the urchin populations remained unchecked. The transition to a new environmental state occurred as a direct consequence of this predatory loss. This phase of the ecosystem's transformation concluded, leaving the kelp forests vulnerable to the next stage of destruction. 10,000% is the staggering rate at which purple sea urchin populations surged along the California coastline following the collapse of their natural predators. Why did these once reclusive creatures transform into an unstoppable force of destruction? One might assume that a lack of predators would simply lead to a steady growth in numbers, but instead it triggered a behavioral shift that fundamentally altered the seafloor. Millions of urchins emerged from the deep crevices of the reefs where they previously waited for drifting organic matter. The process of destruction begins at the very base of the ecosystem. One can notice how the urchins crawl in dense masses onto the kelp holdfasts, which serve as the critical root-like anchors for the entire forest. They gnaw through these thick biological attachments with mechanical persistence. This causes towering fronds reaching lengths of tens of meters to detach from the seabed and drift away into the open ocean. It gets more complex further on. Instead of vibrant underwater forests, vast pale fields known as urchin barrens now dominate the topography. It is visible how the gray rock remains completely stripped of vegetation, carpeted instead with thousands of purple spines packed together with the density of industrial gravel. It seems like a simple case of overgrazing, but in reality, this represents an extreme ecological state where biological productivity falls to near zero. The entire structure of the forest disappears. Survival under these conditions is driven by an alarming physiological resilience. When the kelp is entirely consumed and food becomes scarce, the urchins do not perish from hunger. They instead enter a prolonged state of starvation survival by shrinking their internal organs and drastically lowering their metabolic rates. The equipment of their bodies effectively enters a standby mode, allowing them to endure for several years with almost no nutritional intake. But this is just the beginning. These organisms are frequently called zombie urchins because they remain nearly devoid of any commercial or nutritional value to other species. Despite their hollowed internal state, they stay mobile and alert on the barren rock. The moment any new kelp sprouts attempt to take root, the starving urchins immediately devour them, preventing the forest from ever regenerating. The process is only gaining momentum as these barrens expand across the shelf. The ecosystem remains locked in this unproductive cycle. The urchins continue to occupy the territory while the kelp remains unable to anchor itself to the seafloor. From here, the environment transitions into a state of long-term stasis, where the original biological balance is entirely replaced by a singular, resilient species. Thus, the underwater landscape reaches a point of total transformation, leaving the previous forest structure behind. 2 urchins per square meter. This is the exact threshold established by researchers to determine the survival of entire underwater forests. Why is such a specific and low density required for ecological recovery? At first glance, a few extra sea urchins seem harmless, but in reality, their unchecked grazing prevents kelp spores from ever reaching maturity. By maintaining this precise limit, scientists allow the kelp to anchor its holdfasts and grow at a rate that outpaces the consumption of the purple sea urchins. Direct intervention became the only viable path when the risk of losing the kelp forests of Southern California became absolute. The Bay Foundation initiated a restoration effort that stands as one of the most persistent and ambitious operations ever recorded on the United States West Coast. But this is just the beginning. Commercial divers and highly trained volunteers have been descending onto the rocky reefs surrounding the Palos Verdes Peninsula since 2013. One can notice how the divers maneuver through heavy surges and navigate areas of extremely low visibility to reach the seabed. They utilize hammers and specialized manual tools to physically reduce the urchin population. This is not a mission of total eradication, but a process of careful recalibration. The work is grueling and requires thousands of hours of manual labor beneath the surface of the ocean. It gets more complex further on. The strategy involves more than just clearing the seafloor of thousands of purple sea urchins. The Bay Foundation coordinates closely with marine protected areas to ensure the safety of native rockfish and other local species. These predators are essential for re-establishing the natural biological controls that once kept the ecosystem in balance. It only looks obvious to remove the immediate threat, but in reality, the long-term health of the reef depends on these complex predatory relationships. The process is only gaining momentum as the years of labor begin to yield measurable results. Each square meter of kelp that reappears on the reef serves as physical evidence of success. This remains a labor-intensive and financially demanding battle against ecological collapse. One can notice the vibrant green fronds of the kelp rising once again from the rocky substrate where there was once only barren stone. Transition to the next level. Deliberate and science-based intervention has effectively reopened a path toward recovery for an ecosystem that was previously locked in a cycle of terminal decline. The underwater landscape gradually transforms as the natural equilibrium is restored through human effort. Thus, the restoration project concludes this phase, opening the road to a self-sustaining marine environment. 6 to 12 months is the exact window of time required for the barren seafloor to begin its physical transformation after sea urchin densities are reduced. Why do these underwater deserts suddenly shift back toward a state of productivity? One might assume the recovery would take decades, but the removal of overgrazing pressure allows the kelp to rebuild its canopy with surprising speed. In certain offshore sectors near Palos Verdes, the canopy coverage expands by 50 to 80% after only a few growing seasons. The process is only gaining momentum. One can notice how the return of the kelp immediately triggers a surge in local biodiversity. Underwater surveys record fish densities in these restored zones that are 2 to 3 times higher than the levels found in nearby urchin barrens. The equipment used by researchers captures a significant rise in the biomass of reef fish and rockfish within just a few years of the initial intervention. Even the red sea urchins, which hold high commercial value, exhibit a drastic improvement in reproductive health. Their gonad mass indices increase several-fold compared to the previous biological desert phase. At first glance, the restoration seems to be solely about animal populations, but in reality, the most significant impact occurs at the chemical level through carbon absorption. Giant kelp grows with extreme rapidity and accumulates substantial biomass in a short period of time. This biological mechanism facilitates the sequestration of carbon within plant tissues and the sediments of the seafloor. It is visible how the deep green layers stretching across the water surface act as a massive atmospheric filter. On a local scale, this recovery helps buffer the effects of ocean acidification. By stabilizing the chemical environment, the kelp creates more favorable conditions for shell-forming species. Mussels, clams, and especially abalone are highly sensitive to even minor chemical shifts in the seawater. Therefore, the presence of a healthy forest is a technical requirement for their survival. Everything only gets more complicated when considering the global implications of these local successes. The deep green canopy serves as physical proof of nature's resilience when the primary stressors are removed. From the coast of California, this specific restoration method is transitioning into a reference model for coastal regions worldwide. Many similar ecosystems currently face their own crises and require a verified technical blueprint for recovery. The material and ecological data collected here provide the necessary foundation for those future efforts. Thus, the restoration process concludes this phase by establishing a stable and self-sustaining environment. 35 million tons. That is the current annual volume of farmed seaweed production across the globe. Why is this marine resource experiencing such a massive industrial expansion? The answer lies in its growth rate, as these aquatic plants rank among the fastest growing organisms on the planet. This sector now accounts for over 95% of the total commercial supply, reaching an estimated market value between $15 and $20 billion. Modern aquaculture operations utilize suspended longline systems situated just beneath the water surface. Long cables stretching hundreds of meters serve as the foundation for seeded strands of seaweed. One can notice the equipment gradually sinking as the weight of the biomass increases. In cold, nutrient-dense environments, the kelp expands by tens of centimeters in a single 24-hour period. But this is just the beginning. The process of maturation takes between 4 and 6 months. Once the crop reaches its target dimensions, specialized harvesting vessels arrive at the site. It is visible how hydraulic systems haul the cultivation lines to the surface. The crew cuts the seaweed and secures it for transport to shore. At first glance, the extraction appears manual, but in reality, it is a synchronized logistics chain. After arrival at the processing facility, the raw material undergoes washing, sorting, and preliminary treatment. Some batches are spread across large areas to be sun-dried naturally, while others move directly into high-capacity industrial plants. It gets more complex further on. Unlike the unpredictable nature of wild harvesting, aquaculture maintains a stable year-round supply of raw materials while reducing the physical pressure on fragile natural ecosystems. Is it possible to replace petroleum-based materials with marine extracts? The transition to a blue-green economy suggests that renewable marine resources are the key to sustainable manufacturing. In Namibia, where the coastline faces persistent plastic waste despite bans on straws in 2024 and single-use bottles in 2025, seaweed offers a functional solution. Researchers from Flinders University and the German firm CH Bioforce have pioneered a biodegradable coating. This bio-based film is composed of sodium alginate extracted directly from kelp. The material demonstrates oil resistance, moisture protection, and heat tolerance levels that match traditional petroleum-based plastics. One can notice how the coating maintains its structural integrity under thermal stress. The process is only gaining momentum as the film is designed to decompose fully in natural environments. Beyond packaging, seaweed is undergoing rigorous testing for the production of advanced biofuels and bioplastics. Significant research also focuses on livestock feed additives designed to suppress methane emissions in cattle. Everything only gets more complicated as these diverse applications converge into a single value chain. Biology, heavy industry, and climate science are no longer isolated sectors, but are becoming interconnected components of a unified economic ecosystem. Golden columns of kelp rise once again through the cold waters off the coast of Palos Verdes. This recovery is not the result of random chance or environmental luck. It is the specific product of deliberate scientific intervention and thousands of hours of labor conducted on the seafloor. The equipment moves through the water with precision, restoring the links in the ecological chain that were previously lost. California's underwater forests demonstrate that ecosystems can recover from a state of total decline. However, the restoration process reveals that waiting for natural recovery always incurs a higher cost than proactive intervention. The return of the kelp proves that nature can rebound when industrial and scientific efforts are aligned. The molten stream of innovation continues to flow into new markets. Thus, the seaweed industry reaches a standard ready for the next phase of global integration.